Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Cellco Health podcast. I'm thrilled to have Dr. Paul Clayton with us today to unpack some serious health topics from balancing your omega 3 to optimizing gut health. Let's jump into the conversation. Dr. Clayton is a leading figure in the field of clinical nutrition and preventative health. He's the former chair of the Food and Health Forum at the Royal Society of Medicine in London and has served as a fellow at the Institute of Food, Brain and Behavior in Oxford. He's currently a visiting professor at the Institute of Interdisciplinary Medicine in Moscow. Beyond his academic roles, Dr. Clayton has spent decades researching how diet and lifestyle affect long-term health, writing multiple books and papers on the topic. His work has been pivotal in showing the link between chronic inflammation and diseases like heart disease, diabetes, and neurodegenerative conditions. He's also been at the forefront of product development as the chief scientific officer at Zinzino, a company known for its personalized health solutions. Dr. Clayton, thank you so much for joining us today with such an impressive background. I'd love to start by asking, what led you down this path of exploring how nutrition can prevent and treat chronic diseases?
Oh, it had very humble beginnings. I went to medical school at the University of Edinburgh a long time ago, back in 1968. And at that time, the whole concept of medicine was almost exclusively embedded in pharmaceutical technology and thinking. And that, in turn, you can trace back to the works of many great medical scientists, including the great Louis Pasteur, this concept of magic bullets, which is still core, central in the pharmaceutical model of crisis management healthcare or reactive healthcare. So in 1968, that was absolutely how medicine was and how it was going to develop. There was no question. This was the era, it was the start of the era of the great blockbusting drugs. And I was interested in all of that, of course, but I was beginning to become aware, even then, that this could not be the whole of what medicine should be. And one of the reasons was that I was starting to go to classes, share classes with a very beautiful veterinary student who I fell in love with. It was unrequited, but I'd still go to her classes anyway. And she was hearing from her professors that nutrition was crucially important in maintaining animal health, whether you were talking about commercially important animals or whether you were talking about domestic animals. And I went back to my own professors in med school and said, hang on, over there in the vet department, they're talking about nutrition. Why don't we do more about that? And you have to remember, this was 1968. The past is a different country. And my professor said to me, nutrition, well, that's women's work. Put that aside, put aside these foolish baubles and learn pharmacological medicine. So I did, but I still had this nagging voice at the back of my brain saying, well, hang on, nutrition is important. It isn't just about developing more specific and better blockbuster drugs. So I was going to the med school and doing all the right things during the day. And in the evening, I was scouring the literature, because we had a fabulous scientific library at the Edinburgh University attached to the medical school, and I spent countless hours climbing up ladders to reach dusty old volumes off top shelves or diving down into the basement where they had these long rows and rows of books. You had handles to move these shelves, they were so enormous, looking for obscure papers and bits of evidence that might give more of a steer as to what the relevance of health and nutrition, what that connection might be all about. And it took years of studying until I finally I got into the point where I could take all these different little pieces of information and I began to see a pattern emerging. So a lot of other really good scientists had done experiments here, there, and everywhere, and it was like the beginnings of the map of the dark continent of Africa. You had all these explorers who'd mapped out a bit here and a bit there, and perhaps for the first time, I was able to sit back and say, well, hang on, this all joins together. And I wrote a book trying to encapsulate my thinking on this, and it was called Health Defense. And it became one of the first textbooks, perhaps the first, I'm not sure, of what subsequently came to be known as pharmaconutrition. So I'm not a
Okay.
nutritionist, not at all. I don't teach nutrition. I don't really use nutritional tools. What I was doing, because I'd been trained as a pharmacologist, a pharmaceutical pharmacologist, I began to realize you could use the same uh, techniques and principles and concepts that the science of pharmacology had given us and applying that to nutritional elements. So looking at the pharmacological attributes of foods and food derivatives. You could call this natural pharmacology, some people do. Years and years ago, I coined the term pharmaconutrition. And I remember discussing this at a meeting of the Committee on the Safety of Medicines down in London. And there were assorted professors there, about 24 of them. And I said, well, maybe we should be looking at pharmaconutrition. And they just turned to me and said, what is that? What are you even talking about? It doesn't exist. And I said, well, look, I think what it means is parsing the multiple metabolic errors that we knew even then were driving the chronic degenerative diseases, and cross-referencing against those metabolic errors the known pharmacological attributes of different foods and food extracts. And I thought, if we put all these things together in the right place, we should be able to block all of these metabolic problems. And if we did, maybe the diseases wouldn't progress.
Yeah. Okay.
And it sort of went down that. It started from there. The rot set in there.
Yeah, and in my research, I saw that you've written extensively on food. I came across and how food can be used as a tool to prevent and reverse chronic diseases. And I saw one of your books, "Let Food Be Your Medicine," and it was incredibly interesting to see some of the things that you referenced. But I'd like to know, if you could share with us. What your thoughts were and how you look at nutrition and how it can be used as a means of tackling chronic disease like heart disease, diabetes, and neurodegenerative conditions.
Well, you mentioned 3 different categories of illness, but I think, again, one has to start by stepping back from the detail and to see whether you could discern a larger pattern, the 30,000-foot view. And when you do that, what you see is that since 1900, and particularly since about 1950, we've seen a huge increase in the numbers, not just of heart disease, neurodegenerative disease, cancers, all those things, but 70 or 80 different conditions, chronic degenerative conditions, have all increased hugely. And not only that, we have seen new diseases emerging, which we've never seen before. When I was at med school, we had maybe 20 or so autoimmune diseases, and they were thought to be uncommon. They were considered uncommon. Now there's well over 100, and they're the 3rd most common disease category. Something is clearly happening. The population as a whole is sickening, and we're seeing more cancers. You've seen all the headlines about increasing colorectal cancer in young people, for example, but actually cancers are increasing right across the board. And we're seeing more Alzheimer's, more Parkinsonism. We're seeing more problems with children on the spectrum, not just ADD, ADHD, autism, but also oppositional defiant disorder. We're seeing more conduct disorder children, and these, of course, are people who are going to have a high risk, a high likelihood of ending their lives abruptly or in jail. I mean, we're seeing more of these. We're building up huge amounts of problems here. And I could keep on picking diseases almost at random. I mean,
Sure.
what we used to call non-alcohol fatty liver disease, and now is MASLD, it's metabolic MASLD, metabolic dysfunctional associated fatty liver disease, steatosis.
Yep.
I'm sorry, they keep on changing the terminology to avoid hurting people's feelings, and in a continual search to make these things more accurate. Again, that was the condition that affected perhaps 1 in 5 30 years ago, and it's now at a point where it's affecting almost half the world's population. So all of these diseases are becoming more common, and almost all of them, with the obvious exception of the spectrum problems, are occurring in younger and younger people. What you see is a picture of a population that is being chronically and systematically poisoned. And we talked about the era of the blockbuster drugs. We've had half a century of the continuous development of increasing numbers of these very potent, very specific, and highly toxic drugs. Huge investment of manpower, woman power, and money has gone into this. And at the same time, our public health has declined, and it's declined seriously badly.
Yeah.
What's wrong with this picture? And I think you're forced to come to the conclusion that the way in which we're developing healthcare systems, which are reactive, which are pharmacocentric, have not done anything at all to arrest the underlying decline in public health, which has been going on, as I said, for at least half a century. And that's where the use of food as medicine comes in. Now, food as medicine is a concept I'm not that keen on, because to really change your health around, you've got to make such substantial changes in what you eat that, in practical terms, not many people are willing to go along with that and do it systematically enough and long enough to create the metabolic changes that will eventually lead to a difference in the trajectory of your health. So I prefer to use the term pharmaconutrition, where we're using very specific, very small, very manageable amounts of different combinations of nutrients and micronutrients, which you can add to whatever you're doing. And even if you continue in your wicked ways, and even if you're continuing to live in the 21st century, eating a 21st century diet, which is pretty disastrous, you can use these types of formulations as antidotes. And that is the approach that Zinzino allowed me to make, stepping out of the academic world and into the real world. Because at a certain point in time, the ideas aren't enough. I mean, they might be beautiful on their own, but you have to turn them into praxis.
In your research, you have pointed out that inflammation is often the root cause of many of these diseases. So, how did you make the connection between chronic inflammation and the modern diet? And given your focus on inflammation, omega-3 fatty acids have come up as a critical nutrient. So, why do you think so many people today are deficient in omega-3s, despite its well-known health benefits? And before we dive into specific solutions like Zinzino, the balance oil, can you explain why omega-3 is such a powerful nutrient when it comes to fighting inflammation and supporting overall health?
Well, look, I'm not going to make the claim that I was the person who discovered the importance of inflammation. I'm not that person at all. Many other very good and some great scientists made that connection. I came in. I'm riding on their coattails. So, omega-3s, how do they fit into that? Well, everyone says they're good at reducing chronic inflammatory stress, and they sort of are. Where does that story come from? It comes from some work that was done many years ago by a generation of scientists before mine, including a couple of Danish physiologists called Bang and Duerberg, who were looking at the Inuit in Greenland, because Greenland was, and maybe still is, associated. I think it was considered to be Danish territory, and they went out there, looked at what people were eating, and thought, well, is there something here that might be protective, that's protecting them from example, from cardiovascular disease? And they looked at oily fish, which was also already not quite right, because actually at that time the Inuit were eating more marine mammals than oily fish. But nonetheless, the physiologists correctly identified the long-chain omega-3 puffers, or huffers, some people call them, as being an important part of this protective anti-inflammatory dietary regime. And they were right. They were absolutely right, but only half right. And the reason why they pulled out the omega-3s was, or as opposed to anything else, or as opposed to a combination of actives, was because they were very influenced in their thinking by this concept of specificity. They thought it must be one thing. And so, although they were half right, they were completely wrong, because fish oil on its own, the commercial product, which has been deodorized and it's been degulled, it's bleached, and various other things are done to it, by the time you end up taking it, all the chaperone compounds are gone. And the omega-3s on their own don't work. And it's not just me saying this. This is the Cochrane Collaboration, which is an international network of the good and the great. And they look at all the studies, and then they conduct meta-analytical work. And they've come to the conclusion that fish oil has barely any, and perhaps no effect, in protecting against heart disease or cancer or neurodegenerative disease or retinal pathologies or anything like that. Fish oil doesn't work. And yet you go back to the Inuit, and something's going on. Now, we now know it's a bit more complicated than it was originally thought to be. They have a number of genetic shifts, which actually are really important and make it possible for them to consume such high amounts of omega-3s, which would incur very substantial oxidative stress if we tried to do that. And I was very puzzled by this because I knew that Bang and Dora were correct. Were protected. Other people who ate large amounts of oily fish, significant amounts of oily fish, also seemed to be protected. And there was epidemiological studies that showed that up. One of the academics involved in that was a professor called Refsum, who did some wonderful work. And it showed again and again that if you had more fish in your diet, you were healthier. You had less degenerative issues, less cardiac problems. And yet every study we did with fish oil didn't work. So what's the difference? And I was thinking, wait a minute, there's something really wrong here. Any scientist, when you're given sets of data like that, which simply can't be made to marry up, that triggers acute cognitive dissonance. You're thinking, there's something wrong. And I think what happened was a lot of scientists just didn't want to go there. They thought, okay, there's an issue here. Let's go and do something else. I'm wired up in such a way that when I start feeling uneasy and uncomfortable because I can't make the data fit, I run towards that. I mean, that's very often where you find insights that might help you to amend and extend the conceptual model you'd been previously working with. Those areas where it doesn't fit, that's where you have to go and look. And so about 10 years ago now, I wrote perhaps the first paper about what the difference is between fish oil and oily fish oil. And it's a furrow that I've plowed on and off since then. And I've now got to the point where I realize that, I'm convinced that what was protecting those people who eat seafoods, and particularly cold water seafoods, yep, the omega-3s are a part of it, but only when combined with a very peculiar set of polyphenols called fluorotannins. Long story. The same algae that make the omega-3 at the base of the marine food webs, they also produce these fluorotannins. They bind very tightly together. The fluorotannins are the chaperones that nature developed to make sure that these omega-3s didn't spontaneously combust and kill the life form that was creating it, kill the algae. Many of these polyphenols are amphiphilic, so they have one end that's water-soluble, one end that's lipid-soluble. And guess what happens? The lipid-soluble part sits in the little globules of the omega-3s, and the part that's water-soluble sits outside in the aqueous environment. So it forms little liposomal-like structures, which are incredibly stable. And so under these conditions, the omega-3 and the polyphenols migrate together from the algae into the gut, and then the tissues of the krill, and then the gut and the tissues of the pelagic fish, and then the larger fish, and then the marine mammals, and then the apex predator, which might be an Inuit, or it might be your grandmother who's sitting down eating a dish of roll mops. The omega-3s and the polyphenols travel together. They are always bound together. You never find the omega-3s on their own in the food webs because they're too damn fragile. And likewise, if you take the omega-3s without these chaperone compounds, which is what the fish oil industry has given us, unfortunately, you end up with an oil that is so unstable that when you eat it, a number of things happen. Firstly, whether you're using D-alpha tocopherol or ascorbyl succinate or astaxanthin, whatever antioxidant you're using, that'll keep the oil sweet in the capsule or in the stainless steel holding tank. But when you swallow that oil is now entering a chemically very aggressive environment. Changes in pH, temperature, partial pressure of oxygen, the presence of other oxidants and antioxidants. And under those conditions, the antioxidants that the fish oil industry uses don't work. And in fact, in certain conditions, they become pro-oxidant and increase the breakdown of these fragile omega-3s into malondialdehyde and hexanols and nonanols. And these you don't want in your body. They're toxic. They're not only cytotoxic, but actually quite a few of them are arrhythmogenic. That is, they increase the likelihood of, amongst other things, atrial fibrillation. And by now, alarm bells should be going off in your head, because recently we have heard of a number of studies which suggest, I don't think they quite yet prove it, but certainly suggest that taking fish oil of the badly formulated kind may increase the risk of atrial fibrillation in people who are, for other reasons, predisposed to it. I think that the current generation of fish oil products on the market I think it's so badly formulated that shoddy products and actually potentially toxic. If you've had the foresight to eat your omega-3s together with the polyphenols, which you do when you eat oily fish, firstly, you don't see these breakdown products developing in the body because the polyphenols are there. Secondly, more of the omega-3s get not just into the blood, but into your cell membranes. And that's where they exert their anti-inflammatory effects. So, it's a long answer.
Sorry to interject then, Dr. Clayton, but so I mean, it's clear we know that they're crucial for our health, but are you saying that what's ended up happening is so many people out there buying off the shelf products are possibly harming themselves, but certainly buying a completely inferior product, possibly just wasting their money, and this is the mechanism that works is by the attachment of that polyphenol that's happening when you're eating the fish product, or as you said, grandma eating the roll mops, or something in that situation. But the population out there in all good faith, going to their local pharmaceutical store or whatever it may be and buying a product off the shelf are wasting their time and are, as a result, deficient in omega-3.
Absolutely. I mean, they're wasting their time, they're wasting their money, they're taking a product which will not help them at all and which may harm them. And I've actually had conversations with senior figures in the fish oil industry saying, well, hang on, all the evidence says your products don't work. And off the record, they'll say, well, we know that, but it's great business.
This is the problem, is that it's great business, it would seem. Yeah. And the thing is that you pointed out there, it would be one thing if you were just taking something that wasn't working, but the possibility that it's actually harming you is alarming. Should be alarming for most people.
It does worry me. I am concerned. And we have a number of lines of evidence that actually support this. So, for example, at Zinzino, they have this enormous library. I think it's close to 1.5 million blood samples now, where what we do is is this self-use dried blood spot technology. It's highly validated. And what we know is that in Europe, for example, the average 6-to-3 ratio is about 15-to-1. So the higher the 6-to-3 ratio in general, the more inflammatory stress you have. We can talk about the omega-3 index later. If you take a fish oil supplement, and we've got people who do that, and then we measure their blood, that brings it down from 15-to-1 down to about 10-to-1. So it's moving in the right direction, but you're not getting to the finishing post. Because to really switch off chronic inflammatory stress, you need to get the ratio down below 5-to-1, and the omega-3 index up to about 8%. Commercial fish oil products can't do that, because so much of those fish oil molecules, so much of the omega-3s are being broken down before they get to where they're needed, that you simply can't get enough into the cell membranes to have an anti-inflammatory effect. In people who eat large amounts of cold water seafood, and there are populations like this in the northwest of Europe, first of all, their blood lipid profile shifts to the point where the 6-to-3 ratio drops down below 5, the index comes up to 7-8%, sometimes higher, and guess what? They don't really have much chronic inflammatory stress at all. And the only other group that mimic that are those people who take this combination of the fish oil and the olive oil, which puts back the polyphenols back into the mix, and they are like the habitual fish eaters. 6-to-3s below 5-to-1, got nice omega-3 indexes, and guess what? What we use, we measure the test. We use this test to monitor their condition. We can see the 6-to-3 ratio falling. We can see the index creeping up. Once they get to the horizon of 5-to-1 and 8%, the symptoms associated with chronic inflammatory stress start to fade away, and they disappear. Wow. And it doesn't matter whether those chronic inflammatory symptoms are dermatological or respiratory or musculoskeletal, they all go.
Yeah. And so just to really drill down on that a little bit more, the Zinzino Balance Oil is how you have created or simulated that process of the polyphenol along with the omega-3. Is that correct? Am I seeing that correctly?
No, that's absolutely correct. It's an attempt to reconstitute the original oily fish. So the balance oil is like an oily fish in liquid form. It's not fish oil, whatever it is. I'm not saying that's the only way to skin a cat.
Sure.
I'm sorry, I hope the vegans and vegetarians in the audience don't mind that rather grisly metaphor, but it works. It works extremely consistently. And So the polyphenols are important, and you have to have the right polyphenols because most polyphenols in nature are actually they tend to be a little bit more hydrophilic. They're not necessarily going to act as chaperones at all. The only the polyphenols I'm aware of, but I'm sure someone will correct me if I'm wrong, that will do the job have this amphiphilic characteristic. You'll find them, some of them, in the cold water marine algae that produce omega-3s, and you'll find some in olive. And in fact, that might be one of the reasons, one of the things that underpins the so-called, the health benefits attached to the Mediterranean diet. I think that it's a possibility. So it's the combination of the two. Now, there's two things that are going on here. I'm sorry it's so complicated. The polyphenols are the chaperones that help you get the omega-3s not just into the blood, but keeps them sweet until they can be built into the cell membranes, where they do their thing. The polyphenols then do something else. Very interesting molecules. They've delivered the omega-3s, and the next thing is they start to reduce inflammatory stress themselves in a different and complementary way. So the omega-3s are operating at the top of this inflammatory cascade. It's a long, complicated sequence. And somewhere down at the bottom, you've got a number of things going on which culminate in the release of a group of very destructive enzymes called matrix metalloproteases. And what they do is they dissolve the matrix. And I'm not talking Keanu Reeves here or any of that stuff. We're talking about the ECM, which is a three-dimensional mesh of microfibers like collagen, elastin, but about 300 others, that hold all your tissues together. It's like a soft skeleton. They hold all your tissues together in the right orientation so that they can communicate with each other and coordinate and function collectively as a tissue or as an organ. If you're leaching these enzymes into whatever area the inflammation is occurring in, you're dissolving the matrix. And the cells start to become disorganized, they start to move apart, you start to see the progressive disorganization and destruction of healthy tissue. That's one of the hallmarks of many of the chronic degenerative diseases. So this is where the polyphenols come in. If you've used oily fish or balance oil, the omega-3s are at the top, the polyphenols come in at the bottom. And they do several things. They downregulate the genes that are expressing these particular enzymes. So that's an epigenetic effect. They're directly inhibiting the enzymes as well by binding to a covalent metal ion that is at the active site of these enzymes. So it's reducing the activity of the enzymes, it's reducing their amount. Very recently, we found that polyphenols have a third really interesting effect. They interrupt the release of these destructive enzymes from the cell as well. So you're producing less of them in the cell, you're releasing less of them, and the enzymes that are released are less active. So it's by adding the polyphenols back into the mix, combining them with the omega-3s, that you get this really super effective reduction of chronic inflammatory stress. And if I'm going to be really critical here about the fish oil industry, I would say that a lot of the people in that industry know what's going on. They actually understand how defective their formulations are, but they just don't care enough to modify them. Or they think, well, if we take a step back and say, okay, well, now we have a new improved fish oil, one that actually works, it's difficult for them to change horses in midstream because they've been selling, here's the cure to all your problems, we've made millions and millions and millions of dollars by selling you this horse shit. Sorry, we were wrong. And I got to say, it's difficult for a large company to put their hands up and say that.
Yeah.
So I appreciate that problem.
And you always got to follow the money. You know that they're not going to pull the handbrake up now and say no to all their shareholders, and so they just keep the music playing as the Titanic sinks.
Yeah, well, there is that. I mean, I don't like this pharmaceutical industry at all. The ethical industry, which in fact is one of the most unethical industries on the planet. There are certainly large players in the supplement sector that I don't like at all either.
Yeah. Well, if we were to say that your explanation on the and the polyphenols and how that works within, if we were to look at it from a very much from a 10,000 foot view, and we was to say this is what Benzino balance oil does. What is it connected to an olive oil based polyphenol that's making this uptake mechanism happen in the body easier? Is this what's making it so much more effective? I'm trying to see from the viewer or the listener to the podcast, understanding how it is a superior product to be using, and how it's creating that same environment as what it would be if you were eating it, and rather than taking a supplement off the shelf.
Right. Well, I think the real difference is it doesn't, adding the polyphenols back in doesn't make it easier for you to absorb the omega-3s from the gut. I mean, anyone can do that. But there's a secondary issue. You've got to get the fatty acids from the blood into the cell membranes. That's where they do their magic. That's what we call secondary bioavailability, and you need the polyphenols for that step. And the polyphenols, as I said, are also coming in with their own anti-inflammatory complementary activity. So that's what makes the polyphenols so critical. Everyone talks about the omega-3s being the key compounds, but the polyphenols are just as important. You need to have them together.
And I'm just wanting to drill down a little bit into balance oil from Zinzino. And the reason I want to is because I want to get onto a little bit more in a second is the blood spot test, because I'm told, and I've read extensively, and I'm hoping you're going to tell me as well, that Zinzino as a product and Balance Oil can put their money where their mouth is in terms of the efficacy of this product because of the blood spot test and testing how effective it is. And users of the blood spot test can do this. And am I right in saying that up to 97% of people are walking around and are possibly deficient in omega-3?
I think that's pretty accurate, and that's thanks to the out of control and immoral, frankly, behavior of the multinational food companies and the national food companies that walk the same road. They have effectively created a position where most people are being chronically poisoned. That's how bad the modern diet is. But Barry Popkin refers to this as one of the many nutrition transitions, and it's characterized by this enormous increase in chronic degenerative disease. Yeah, we're all being poisoned. So it's important to know if you have a problem and then being able to measure it, because if you're one of the few people who is eating a good diet and you have good omega-3 levels or the right ratios or the right index, why would you want to buy this stuff? I mean, I don't want to even recommend you take it because you don't need it. So I think that it's always best to start off from a basis, test first and see where you are. Is there an issue? If there isn't, congratulations. And I think what Zinzino then does is they give you your money back. Whatever you paid out for the test, you never needed us at all. If there is a problem, then you can, and very many people who come to you do the test have been taking fish oil and think, oh, I'm going to get a result, I'll get my money back. They do the test, they find out that the results are all over the place, they're not in the right place at all, because their fish oil wasn't properly formulated. And at that point, the scales fall from their eyes, fish scales, and they realize, I've been wasting my money. They start taking balance oil, and then you can take a test again at 2, 3, 4 months or 6 months or whatever, and you can see that the needles are changing, they're moving. And the thing is, as they move, the health problems they had start to become less and they start to disappear. So it's really convergent. You can see the needles moving, you're starting to feel better, you don't need medication anymore to treat your aching joints or your raised blood pressure, and everything is very convergent. People find that extremely convincing. And once they've started that journey and they've realized what the health outcomes are, they tend to want to stay with it.
I can only imagine. I mean, if you're going to start feeling better, but not only that, you've taken a test, you've been using whatever you've been using up until now, you take the dry blood spot test and it goes to our friends at Zinzino and they say...
No. It doesn't go to Zinzino. It goes to a third-party, independent, validated forensic analytical laboratory, which has nothing to do with Zinzino.
Okay, and that's there you go. Thank you for pointing that out. And when I say it like that loosely, I suppose only to say that it's a Zinzino blood spot test, but no doubt, as you pointed out, goes to a third party and it's independently checked. But then after that, once they get their results back and they've started taking balance oil, they can test again and see the results that aren't up for dispute.
Well, absolutely. You can see for yourself that something is going on here, and it all makes sense. And for me, this principle of self-testing is very, very important. It's putting you back in the driver's seat. And instead of saying, well, you're a helpless, ignorant, worthless piece of human meat, go and throw yourself to the tender mercies of the medical establishment and the pharmaceutical industry, which I generally don't recommend. Test yourself, see if there's a problem, and if there is, you can fix it yourself. It's like the medical equivalent of the graphic user interface. You don't have to be an expert programmer in it anymore. You can see for yourself what's happening. If there's a problem, you can fix it. And this is a principle, test-based, self-test-based systems, assays that you can use to monitor your own health and guide your own decisions about diet and supplementing that we're extending into the other areas of our portfolio.
Absolutely. And I mean, it's quite interesting talking to you about it. And I think, since doing my research before us getting on this podcast together and having had a look into it and seen how the blood spot works, and I'm one of those people who my wife and I diligently taking our omega-3s, and I wouldn't be unfair now to name the product. Maybe I should in another podcast.
Let's not do that.
Yeah, no, let's not, is right. But maybe that's for another podcast, as I was saying. But the point being that I've been taking omega-3s diligently for many, many years. And now, having done this research, the very next thing I'm going to be doing as soon as is possible is taking the test and getting onto Balance Oil, where I'm going to be able to report in my findings and exactly how I feel over that period, because it's been pretty startling to realize that, not only could I be taking something that's doing nothing for me and paying money for that, but I could also be doing harm to myself. So this is going to be a real game changer for me to actually just be able to see those test results.
Well, more important, I think that's important, but perhaps even more important is that this is part of a program of disintermediation. That is, we're handing responsibility and information back to you, the consumer. You don't have to go to the doctors. I mean, people will always have to go to the doctors. If you get run over by a bus, then the last thing you want is fish oil or vitamin C. Modern medicine is really good in the golden hour. That's where it shines. And that's where its strengths are. And I think that's where most of it should be. And at a certain point in time, no matter how healthily you live, you're going to end up ill, dying. We're all mortal. And at a certain point in time, you will require the symptomatic management that the pharmaceutical medicine is mostly about. So I'm not against pharmaceutical pharmacology, but it should know its place. It should not be forefront and center of public health care. It should be kept in the back as a last reserve. I can see a future where more people have more access to more important insights into their metabolism and are therefore able to head many medical problems off at the pass. If you can get into prevention, and that prevention is based on real information, which you can modify and see changing in real time, you won't get to the point where you'll need a doctor. Or you may be able to put it off for 10, 20, 30, 40 years or more. Doctors only arrive on the scene late. They get to the point where a disease is causing symptoms. Here's the problem. Many of these chronic degenerative diseases have long preclinical or latent periods because you have a lot of reserve built into your body. You've got a lot of spare capacity. And a lot of that can be damaged before it becomes clinically obvious. So by the time you go to the doctor because you've got severe arthritic pain, a lot of the damage has already been done. The doctor is in the position of like a fire service that only ever gets to the scene of the fire after the house has been burnt halfway to the ground. And when they do get there, they've mostly got the wrong tools. Pharmaceuticals, which are very likely to cause adverse effects, various kinds. I mean, iatrogenic illness caused by the medications that we use is a very significant cause of death. One of the leading causes of death, in fact, in the developed nations. How much better would it be if you could get insight into what's going on inside you and prevent these problems ever from getting to that point where they're causing symptoms and where you do require symptomatic management with pharmaceuticals? Yeah. So prevention is what it's about. It's a kinder way of helping to keep people healthy. It's more effective, actually, and it's far more cost effective. This is a very cheap and easy way to stay healthy.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I think at times that's possibly where the pharmacology industry and the pharmacological products don't like it, because there's a lot of money to be made. But shifting gears a little bit then. Shifting gears a little bit, and I know well, as you've said there, that you don't love the pharmaceutical industry or pharmacology industry that much, but as I have my axe to grind with them at times as well on a lot of things that I read about. But I wanted to shift gears a little bit and sort of talk a little bit about pregnancy,
Mhm.
and it's well known, that mothers or expectant mothers should have their omega-3 index tested during pregnancy, and but it seems very few expectant mothers are maybe fully aware of this, or maybe pay as much attention to it as they should. Um, can you explain why it's so important for them specifically to know their omega-3 levels during that critical time during pregnancy, and maybe what can be done about it? If that's as simple as balance oil as the supplement.
Well, there are a whole range of issues and problems that surround fertility now. Amongst males, sperm counts have been dropping precipitously, as you know, and in females, is a rising incidence of infertility, and we see more problems with polycystic ovary syndrome, toxic preeclampsia, um, a number of all of these issues where clearly nutritional factors are playing a role. Now, I'm not going to say that omega-3s are the only things that you need to take care of. Far from it. I mean, again, we don't want to get into the trap of thinking of single molecules and magic bullets. That's not what it's about. Most people now not only have chronic inflammatory stress, but they also have a variety of other problems caused by the modern diet. So they have dysbiosis, and there's a lot of work that shows that if you're eating the wrong kind of diet, in the wrong population of microbial organisms in the large intestine, and subsequently other tissues, including the placenta, that increases the risk of all kinds of other problems associated with fertility, conception, pregnancy, and childbirth. So, yeah, I think this is a test. The balance test is a very useful thing for women who are wanting to conceive or who are in the early stages of pregnancy should take for their own sake and to improve the risk of bringing a baby to term without exposing themselves to potentially severe risks along the way. But there's another issue here. This is also about protecting the health of the next generation. As I'm sure you're aware, the frequency of children who are developing and presenting with neurodevelopmental disorders is skyrocketing. And if you go to DSM-5, you'll see that in this general grouping, you not only have ADD, ADHD, and autism, dysphasia, dyspraxia, the well-known ones, you also have CD, ODD, and now schizophrenia is being lumped into that thing, a sort of general area as well. So people are thinking, well, maybe this is a neurodevelopmental problem that simply manifests later in life and in a slightly different way. This is where it gets really interesting. A set of issues that we could address, which would reduce the risk of this kind of neuronal misdirection or maldevelopment from taking place in utero. There's been some really elegant work done. I don't want you to run away with the idea that I'm the leading figure in all this. I'm a rapporteur as much as anything. But there's really good scientists working on this problem all over the world. And there was an American study that came out about 18 months ago now. This was a preclinical model showing that if pregnant animals were exposed to certain types of chronic inflammatory stimuli during the pregnancy, the next generation of animals would be born with symptoms that we would regard as the animal equivalent to being on the spectrum. And when you think about it, it's not entirely surprising. Think about how the brain is developing in utero. It's an extraordinary, complex wiring diagram that has all these nerves have got to find their way to the right place. They've got to grow to the right area, make the right connections. They get to generally the right area. They grow their synaptic trees. There's pruning. They make new connections until finally this very dynamic situation settles down. And the nerves, to get to the right place and to make all these fine little connections at the end of it, they're following chemical gradients and probably electrical gradients and probably mechanical gradients as well, because the brain is absolutely crammed full of this extracellular network, which is, I think, it's about 25% of the brain. And if you have chronic inflammatory stress, one of the things that happens is the ECM starts being broken down. So one of the things that's helping the nerve to track to where they need to go is gone. Part of the guidance is gone. And I think probably some of the chemical gradients inside the developing brain are also disturbed by the presence of inflammatory mediators. So the nerves don't get to the right place, or they don't go far enough. And one of my great heroes, John Stein, who was the Oxford Professor of Physiology, was the person who showed that in this situation, a group of neurons called the macroneurons that are responsible for collecting information of various different kinds and creating a composite sort of score or awareness, gestalt vision as opposed to detailed vision, that these nerves don't necessarily all get to the right place. They don't make the right connections. And it kind of makes sense. It kind of fits with some of the symptomology that we see in kids on the spectrum. So I think that even although chronic inflammatory stress is probably not the only factor that can disturb the correct orientation of the growing central nervous system, it's one of them, and it's an important one. And we can take that out of the picture by using balance oil and the balance test to make sure that the mum isn't actually experiencing chronic inflammatory stress, and that therefore these stress-related chemical mediators aren't interfering with this very delicate process of growth and organization that the growing and developing central nervous system is all about. And that keeps on going not just during the second and third trimesters, but also in the first year or so after birth. So breast milk is important, so the mum needs to keep on making sure that they have the right balance of omega-3s and 6s, and polyphenols, by the way. If you eat polyphenols, they get in the breast milk. That's got to be fed to the baby as well, and I don't think that many of the formula manufacturers have really got that right yet. And after weaning, it's also important to make sure that the baby, if you want to give it the best possible start in life, to be able to develop its full biological potential. And this is not a crack at neurodiversity, by the way. But that brain needs all of the right kinds of nutrients which will create the right metabolic environment, the milieu intérieur, as Claude Bernard says, so that the brain can do its thing as it was originally designed to do and reach its full potential.
And a lot of what you're speaking about there is during pregnancy and in utero, Dr. Clayton. But for younger children and for parents that have children that are autistic or possibly on the spectrum, have you observed any effects that create a life that's easier for them, or in a sense, a healthier lifestyle based on any of the improvements in the amount of omega-3s they get in?
Okay, now I'm going to slip into speculative mode, and I'm going to make some outrageous claims.
Sure.
I have this idea. We used to think that after birth, a very early period in life, you didn't grow any more brain cells, that it was kind of a static system. We now know that that's not true. We now know that the hippocampal regeneration takes place almost throughout your life, and in various areas of the subcortices as well. And if you have the right environment, the right diet, and you're doing the right things, you're constantly refreshing the neuronal population of a number of key parts of the brain. I began to think, well, how plastic is this situation? We have this idea that once the baby's been born and it's got to the age of 1, the connections are there and you can't much change it. I'm not so sure about that. I think that the original instructions that these brain cells had to go here and go there and make those connections may still be operating, but they're just being stifled. So possibly, if you give these types of children the types of pharmaconutritional intervention which will improve the environment inside their skull and allow the brain cells to get back to the blueprint and perhaps start making some of the right connections, what would happen? Long story short, some of the people who were using these products started giving them to their kids who were on the spectrum. And we started hearing back amazing stories. I mean, really, really amazing stories. So much improvement going on that these kids were no longer requiring pharmaceutical management. Such changes taking place that you could see that the projected arc of their lives has been completely transformed. Kids who are about to be thrown out of school for disruptive behavior are now able to focus, and they're now moving up from the bottom streams up into the middle or the top streams. Kids where their parents' relationship had been completely degraded because the kid couldn't sleep on his own and he would scream all night if he wasn't in the parents' bed. And you can imagine that's not particularly good for a relationship. And now, for the first time, the kid can sleep in his own bed all night long. And now, for the first time, he's not having to be hauled out of school every day because there's been yet another incident. Now, for the first time, this kid is positive and hopeful, and the parents are saying, this child is going to be a productive and fulfilled human being, rather than ending up in some kind of appalling long-term institution, which, by the way, includes prison. Because a lot of people on the spectrum and with CD and ODD in particular, but with many of the other spectrum conditions as well, end up incarcerated because inappropriate behaviors, problems with reduced impulse control in some cases. The prisons actually have a very high percentage of inmates who have these types of conditions. So for me, the great joy has been I've traveled all over the world. I get to meet people who've been using these products with their children, and sometimes I meet them. And my parents, I meet this kid. It's a lovely kid. I'm having a nice conversation with him. Then the parent will take me aside and say, a year and a half ago, this child wasn't talking. And we're talking about kids who are 7 or 8. They simply weren't interacting. And now this child is making eye contact, and I can't tell that this is a child who ever had a diagnosis of being on the spectrum. Now, let me just say, I'm not an expert. This is not my area, right? But I do know that in a number of countries in Europe now, pediatric neurologists and people who specialize in dealing with children who are on the spectrum are actually reclassifying their kids. They no longer have a neurodevelopmental problem. It's gone.
Wow.
But then there's another question that arises. Is this just going to work short term while they're taking, the fish oil, olive oil thing, and they're reducing inflammatory stress, or is it going to be a longer term thing? Are we actually achieving a long term, perhaps permanent, structural change and rewiring, which is going to allow these kids to really make all the right connections? And that's what I'm beginning to see. Now, it's a huge claim. It's an enormous claim. And of course, the more outrageous the claim, the stronger your evidence has to be. I don't have that. All I've got are a group of case histories, just weak evidence. But there's quite a lot of smoke beginning to build up. And I'm beginning to think, maybe there's a fire here. I think we need to look at this systematically. And I'm very cautious about this because I don't know if it's going to work in every time. And I'm not going to say that it's a miracle cure. There isn't. There is no such thing. But I think some people are telling me it's really been helpful. And that's perhaps as far as I would be prepared to go at this point in time.
Well, it's interesting that you say that, and I think that is one of the things that, as you say, needs to be looked at. It's the embers that start glowing, and if they just get a little bit of help and they start turning into a bit of a flame, is my idea that I've got it. And I've seen that with some of the things in my own life and my health journey, where some of the things that I started seeing and researching were only backed by some forms of anecdotal evidence, and certainly you do see the pharmaceutical industry at times trying to and big food industry trying to stifle some of those anecdotal reports and don't say, well, where is the research? But when enough people start reporting on that stuff, and you hear those stories, like you say, mums coming to tell you those stories, you only have to eventually say to yourself that there's enough mounting anecdotal evidence or so to prove a point.
These are just theories, and I would say I'd say they're weak theories. When you're presented with this type of information, the response has to be, this theory has to be tested to destruction if possible on the Procrustean bed of the randomized prospective placebo-controlled clinical trial. And that's where I think this has to go.
Yeah.
That creates a problem.
But at this point, though, as you said, you were putting on your speculative hat, but have seen a number of these stories. And so there is some mounting, albeit weak evidence to show that there is improvements in the lives of these people.
Well, yeah, I've seen it in case after case. But as I said, these are only case histories, and however dramatic any individual case is, and however moving it might be, and believe me, they're very moving, one has to take a step back and say, is this meaningful? Is this consistent? Is it repeatable? And actually, I don't even think I should be the person to test it. Someone who's hostile to this hypothesis should test it. Yeah. That creates a problem, though, because we're living in a regulatory environment that is hugely influenced by the pharmaceutical industry. I mean, many of the regulatory organizations, EFSA, particularly the FDA, and I think to some extent probably the TGA as well, have been co-opted by financial interests and, of course, predominantly pharmaceutical interests. And we have this situation now where you cannot make a medical claim unless you have a pharmaceutical license attached to the product you're using. You're going to attach that claim to. And we're not working with pharmaceutical products. What we're doing is we're working with food extracts. This is not pharmaceutical pharmacology. It is nutritional pharmacology or natural pharmacology. The moment that we or someone else does a study that shows unequivocally, using this intervention treats or maybe even cures this condition, that's hugely dangerous, because then people are going to start saying, oh, we've got a cure for this or that or the other.
Mm-hmm.
And that's completely illegal. I mean, we'd be shut down, and I'd probably end up in jail. So this science, like every other human activity, is politically embedded. And the politics of health are pretty dirty, unfortunately. So even if we did the study and we found this model, this theory to be true, I would not be able to tell the truth.
Well, then shifting gears a little bit further, then maybe to something that's a little bit out of left field, so to speak, is sport. I do know that from my research, once again, that Balance Oil is approved by Informed Sport.
Yes,
and I'm really interested to get your take on how the omega-3 uptake and Balance Oil is, as we've discovered, being a premium product and better than a lot of other stuff coming off the shelves. How can this help athletes, especially when it comes to managing inflammation and their recovery? And I'm even thinking possibly even things like maybe concussion or injury to brain injury or anything like that. Do you have any thoughts on that? Speculative hat on, anything you like, your thoughts on how it applies to sport?
Well, you're asking very different types of questions here. I mean, concussion is a thing on its own. I mean, I could address that first if you want.
Mm-hmm.
Well, sports-related head injuries are a major issue. And in those contact sports, where there's a lot of high-velocity collisions, it doesn't even matter if the blow is to the head. If you hit hard enough, the shockwaves will travel up through the spine, and they'll rattle your brain in its bath of cerebrospinal fluid, knocking it against the skull, and you can still end with damage that way. And one of the areas where this has come up, probably more than anywhere else, is in American professional football, and to a lesser extent in rugby. And of course, you Australians, you've got Aussie rules, haven't you? Which is, I played rugby for years and years. I love that game. But if I'd been an Australian, I'd have loved Aussie rules. It's a great thing. But in American pro football, you've had so many players now who've gone on to develop brain damage, and it's really profoundly harmed them. And in one study recently that was done in the UK, a Welsh professional rugby team was measured at the beginning and the end of the season, and their season is only 13 games, and their cognitive abilities were measured at the start and then again at the end of the season. And at the end of the season, each player had experienced some degradation of various cognitive functions. And then I began to think, well, are we really that fragile? Were we designed to be like this? I mean, we evolved in a pretty rough, kind of hard scrabble kind of environment where we were continually getting beaten up and knocked down, and we were getting up again and making the best of it and procreating. I mean, humans weren't wiped out. We could fall out of a tree and get knocked out, around on a battlefield or during the hunt, and yet we survived. We didn't all get develop brain damage. And then that's where it gets real interesting, because what the Welsh scientists did, and this was a group out of Cardiff University, they identified the types of damage that was actually happening in the brain, and it's something called oxidative phosphorylative stress. Now, the brain is full of omega-3s, which are very oxidizable, and if you're being traumatized, physically traumatized, you have oxidative phosphorylative stress, which breaks down, amongst other things, the cell membranes and starts triggering chronic inflammatory stress, and then everything starts going in the wrong direction. Well, what is it that protects you from oxidative phosphorylative stress? And I'll tell you, a diet with lots of omega-3s and polyphenols and prebiotic fiber. I was raised in Scotland in the 50s, played a lot of rugby, got the bejesus kicked out of me on numerous occasions, and here I am, still able to construct a reasonably complex sentence, and sometimes even remember the questions that you're asking me. I was eating a diet, a traditional diet, with things like oatmeal and herrings and local fruits in season, which is full of omega-3s and polyphenols and prebiotics. And anyone who, like me, was eating a traditional diet, which we all used to do until the modern turnover into ultra-processed foods, were protected. We were all protected. We weren't that fragile. We were more resilient. We were more robust. We were able to take more damage and get back up again and keep on kicking. Nowadays, it really doesn't matter how much bodybuilding you do, how much muscle you have, how much armor you're wearing. Internally, you're really vulnerable because these vital protective factors have been taken out of the diet. You'd be better off, instead of wearing a football helmet, go onto the field having eaten a proper diet, protecting your brain. It's the same thing with boxers. You can wear protective headgear. They won't protect you. We know it doesn't. The figures are there to show it. What protects you is eating the right type of diet. So, but that's not all. No, not all sports are about contact. I think that kind of high velocity contact. But let's talk about things like running and cycling and swimming. Well, whether you're training in the off season or you're competing during the season, intense physical activity does result in localized chronic inflammatory stress. And that is one of the things that is involved in muscular training and regeneration. But if you have too much inflammatory stress, it means that you're going to have more muscle pain, delayed onset muscle pain and stiffness. And as we all know, that goes on to downgrade your physical performance, right? And it's been shown time and time again. So the idea is it would be a better idea rather than eating a modern diet, which gives you too much inflammatory stress, which means you have more of that downtime than you need. Let's bring that back to normal. So you can still have a little bit of inflammation. That's a healthy part of the reaction to exercise. That's part of what reorganization and rebuilding is all about, but not the excessive kind. And by taking balance oil and bringing yourself back into the zone, what I find is, first of all, it doesn't, you don't stop building muscle. I mean, in terms of lean body mass, I'm actually at the same ratio I was when I was 30. So I haven't lost muscle, which is of course age-related sarcopenia is really prevalent. It's a major healthcare problem. You don't have to do it. Chronic inflammatory stress will help to drive progressive muscle mass, sarcopenia, metabolic problems, and push you towards the exit. You don't want to do that. So it doesn't damp the inflammatory response to the point where you can't function properly. But what it does do, it means that next time you do an exercise that you haven't done before, or you go at it harder than you did before, you won't have this severe delayed onset muscle pain after the exercise. You'll recover faster, you'll be able to train harder, you'll perform better when you're back out on the running track or on the pitch. Now, I could do a new exercise tomorrow. I could drop and give you 60. And I don't have any pain in my pectoral muscles after that at all. Or I could go out and run a couple of 100 meters, and then I don't have muscular pain in my thigh muscles. I don't get it. And if you think about it, that's how nature works. If you're a gazelle on the African veldt, and along comes a lion, and you run for your life, and the next morning you wake up, the sun is rising up over the Serengeti, and you're thinking, oh, I've got muscle pain. I don't feel like running today. And along comes the next lion, and you're toast, mate. That's evolution won't allow that to happen. If you're living in a natural lifestyle and eating the diet that you were designed to eat, these types of problems simply don't arise. What we think of as natural is not natural at all. It's an artifact created by this profoundly unhealthy exposome that we have allowed to be created for us. And a large part of that is what we put into our mouths.
That's a great analogy. The gazelle doesn't get an opportunity to say, I need to do some stretching first before the lion comes along. That's
that's not a good strategy.
It's a bad strategy for a long life. And in that environment, it matters. We're safe, but in that environment, it matters. That's very interesting. But now, I know another area that I think you're very passionate about, and you've touched on this in this conversation already. But I'd like to get a little bit more information on that. This is gut health and the idea of how gut health, how critical it is for our overall well-being. And I think there's a lot of confusion at times. People talking about probiotics, possibly versus prebiotics, and I know that you are involved with a prebiotic made by Zinzino that That's very interesting to me after having done my research. But can you firstly just give us, just to cut the confusion, give us some idea of the difference between that and also and touch on overall gut health and the importance of it?
Well, let's sort of break down the categories first. Probiotics are the so-called friendly bacteria. When people think about those, they think about bifidobacteria, lactobacilli, maybe a few others. And the big food manufacturers put them into yogurt and yogurt drinks and things like that, and they're supposed to help. Or you can buy them in supplement form with a couple, countless billions of colony-forming units per capsule and all that kind of thing. And the one thing all these products have in common is they don't really do much. They don't work. And it's not really surprising why, because you're using lab-grown strains of bacteria which have been cosseted. They've grown in optimal configurations. They're not really battle-hardened. And you're sending in what might look like a large number on the back of the label, but when you send them into the gut, you're sending them into an environment where the numbers of microbes already present vastly outnumber whatever probiotic supplement you're taking by thousands to one against, tens of thousands to one against. So it's like sending in a group of Girl Guides to fight the Chinese Liberation Army. They haven't got a chance. They haven't got a hope in hell. They don't last. They don't have much of an effect. And I was on the edge of a little study that's done in London where they gave people probiotics, and you could measure traces of these probiotics in the stool every day that people were taking the probiotics. The day after they stopped taking them, they were gone. They don't take. And this is a phenomenon called colonization resistance. So the bugs that are living inside you have gotten used to you. They know the environment. They're very comfortable there. They can fight their corner. When the newcomers come in, they say, no room for you here. No room at the inn. Keep on moving. And and they do. If you want to really change the microbiome, what you have to do is to send in fuel for the good guys that are already there. No matter how bad your diet, you're going to have a few of the good bacteria still lingering on in the large intestine. Send in the supplies that they need. And these are what we call prebiotics, and they're fibers. Technically, they're carbohydrates. So you've got different types of fibers. You've got cellulose and lignin, and lignin is a polyphenol. Cellulose is what you see when you walk through nature. There's trees and grasses and what we make into paper. You can't use that. Hemicellulose is a prebiotic fiber. It encourages the growth of certain keystone species in the microbiota. And then you have, for example, you've got fructooligosaccharides, you've got 1,3,1,4 beta-glucans, you've got resistant starches and inulins. Those are the prebiotics that are really helpful in transforming the microbiota in the gut. Now you've got to take these products in the right proportion, these molecules in the right proportions, so that you've got enough to turn the microbial population around in the ascending, transverse, descending, sigmoid, and throughout the entire large intestine. And you can't do that with inulin or phos. You've got to have all these different fiber types in roughly the right proportions. And here's the kicker. We used to eat a lot of these fibers. I mean, a lot. If you look at some of the studies that were done on pre-Christian Mesoamerican cultures, such as the Autism people, this data we have suggests they were consuming about 140 grams of these fibers a day. So their gut was full of the right bacteria. And the right bacteria produce compounds which stop inflammation and kill off cancer cells. I mean, that's a good environment to have. Fast forward. Now it's 1850, 1890. That's a period that I've studied. They're eating about 40 grams of these fibers. And again, the data tells us, because we've got good medical records from this period, there's no IBS, there's no IBD. I mean, very, very rare, hardly any colorectal cancer. How much of these fibers are we eating now? It's down to about 4 grams a day. From 140 to 40 to 4. So the good bacteria are starving. Our gut is filling up with bad bacteria, unhealthy bacteria, which are causing chronic inflammatory stress, which is contributing to the risk of some very serious problems indeed. And problems also which are transferred from the gut, which now becomes leaky to other tissues such as the liver and the brain and the cardiovascular system. So it's important to put the prebiotic fibers back into your diet, where they've always been. The food industry took them out. The modern food industry put them out highly irresponsibly. We've got to put them back in.
And so Xenobiotic, I believe, is the product that is being developed. At what stage of development is the product, and is this an effective prebiotic to use in this instance?
It's been around for quite a while. I actually
Okay.
developed the formulation almost 5 years ago, and it's
Wow.
become very important worldwide. A lot of people rely on it. There's only one contraindication. If you have SIBO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, you can't take it. You're supposed to go on the FODMAP diet, which actually comes out of the University of Monash. A shout out
Okay.
to my fellow scientists there. I don't particularly like the FODMAP diet, and I think there's other ways of resolving this issue. But if you do have SIBO, you can't be eating these types of prebiotic fibers. But for everybody else, they're a must.
I got it. Wow. And is there a similar way to test with the Zinzino product so that we're in a position to understand what is happening with uh, the gut and the microbiome?
I'm glad you asked, Alan. Um, okay, there's different ways you can measure this. You can do a kind of a full spectrum analysis of all the microbes in the gut, which is expensive, it's time consuming, it's probably not that helpful because there's a lot of microbes that we can't even culture properly outside the gut. So there's a lot of dark matter there. I took a different line and I thought, well, maybe it's more important to look at the physiological functionality of the large bowel. And one of the things that happens if you have all the wrong bacteria, proteolytic, a lot of which are gram-negative, chronic inflammatory stress, what happens is that colonic barrier, epithelial barrier function breaks down. You get leaky gut. That's what people call leaky gut. And really unpleasant chemicals like lipopolysaccharides, there's families of them, migrate into the bloodstream, and they're very pro-inflammatory. Very profoundly involved in quite a wide range of inflammatory pathologies. And difficult to measure LPS in the blood because, as I said, there's a whole group of molecules. Easier to measure something called LPS binding protein because the body responds when LPS gets into the blood by secreting something called LPS binding protein. And you can measure that. And that's what we've been doing together with VTest. They've been working on that. I think we're at the point of alpha testing. Hopefully we'll be able to roll that out soon. And this is the equivalent to the balance test. Don't buy a xenobiotic. Don't even need to change your diet without testing first. Maybe you don't need to buy a product or make any changes. Do this test. It's another dried blood spot test. If you've got low levels of LPS binding protein, you're great. You've got the right microbiota, you're clearly eating the right food, and this is a problem you don't have to worry about. If the levels of this binding protein are going up and up and up, you've got dysbiosis. This is increasing your risk of a number of different serious health problems further down the line. If you don't already have them, you'd be better advised to put this right. Here's a product, take this, do the test again, see for yourself. Yep, the needles are moving in the right direction.
So did you say that this test is already out or is it in the process of being finalized?
No, it's not out yet. It can't be rolled out yet. This is really still a lab-based test. And
Okay.
we've got, this has to be refined. There's a lot of technical refinement that has to be done before this can be made into a reliable self-based test. So something that people can use at home. But we're going to get there.
Yeah, of course. I'm sure you will. Well, then, what I left for the last questions of the podcast, Dr. Clayton, is wanting to touch on the last few years, the pandemic. It's been a bit of a chaotic period, and you know, I think there's a lot of people with adverse health conditions as a result of what happened to them, whether they were sick with COVID or possibly any other reasons, vaccine related or whatever. You know, I just wanted to get your opinion on that. Certainly from a point of view of people managing their health post COVID, post vaccine, or anything like that, and any of these products we've discussed today, speculative hat on or not, what they may do to help people that are in these situations.
Well, this is a highly contentious area, and it is. I don't like playing under the guns of the pharmaceutical industry. They have a track record of destroying people who undermine their business model. So I'm going to be very careful in terms of what I say. I think that it's very clear that when the mRNA vaccines were released, they were released due to a combination of unfettered greed by the pharmaceutical industry and uncritical panic by the political systems. I think it amounts to the greatest public health crime that was ever committed. It's grievous public health malpractice. These experimental products should never have been released in the first place, particularly as COVID was not that serious. And we knew that from the start, from the Diamond Princess, effectively, experiment, a floating petri dish, as people call it, full of mainly old and therefore vulnerable people. And even in that group, the mortality was, I think, only about 1.5%, in a group that was already very prejudiced in health terms. So we knew from the start that this was not a major problem. And I think what happened was the pharmaceutical industry saw an opportunity to induce communal panic or mass psychosis, some people would refer to it as. And a lot of politicians hopped on board because they saw this as an opportunity to advance their social engineering and social controlling policies. I think Australia and New Zealand were particularly badly served by your politicians, who clearly don't represent the interests of the people they represent, but represent the interests of the lobbying groups and possibly the globalists. This was, to me, a very dark period in our recent history. And I really hope that people have begun to see it for what it is and won't fall for it again. There are a number of conditions that are being rolled out at the moment, which some people would say they're more paranoid, are being timed to coincide with the American elections, which are clearly very important. There's a new flu variant, and of course, monkeypox or moneypox might be a better way of describing it. These things are bubbling, and they're on the back burner at the moment. And I think that there are people who would love the idea of these conditions being declared to be being epidemics or pandemics, and creating another opportunity to shut everything down and enforce postal voting, which of course is a system that is wide open to abuse. Now, for those people who are suffering from the long-term effects either of COVID or from the COVID vaccines, and the excess mortality is real and continues, I would say that, again, I'm not an expert in this at all. This is not my field. And there's no greater fool than an expert assuming that his or her expertise extends into an area that they don't really know. So you're talking, really, I'm expressing my views as a somewhat semi-educated layperson here, no better than that. But if you're concerned with long-term adverse effects, the people I think you might be better off going to talk to are the FLCCC. And you can find them on the internet. Their information is made freely available. These are good people, to the best of my knowledge, and they have access to information and, more importantly, experience that I don't.
Well, Dr. Clayton, this has been an incredibly insightful and wide-ranging conversation, and a lot of that down to my questions and things that I do know that our audience likes to listen to and find out about. So in finishing up, I mean, the balance oil to me, and the idea that that there is a test that can show your results and prove that to you is remarkable. And gut health, obviously, something that I think is so important. But is there anything for the listeners that as we wrap up here, that you think they should know, or something else that they may want to take away from today's discussion?
Well, you mentioned chronic inflammatory stress as being the cause of many of the ills that we see, and it's certainly a major contributor. But there's three other major drivers of chronic ill health, and I rarely use balance oil on its own. Dysbiosis is obviously very important in contributing to the multiple pandemics of degenerative disease that we're seeing now. So it's important to get the gut microbiota correctly configured. And if you do, that has a ripple effect on the microbiota of other tissues as well. Because every tissue of your body, every organ, I mean, there's no sterile space inside you. Every tissue, including the placenta, the brain, has its own characteristic population of microbes in health and in disease. But I think that the population in the gut is a bit like the ringmaster. If you get that right, that has positive knock-on effects to most, maybe all, of the other tissues. So that's the other thing. I think it's really important to get right. Third thing is, if you're running at about 2,000 kilocalories a day, which is fairly typical for urbanites now, keyboard warriors, and a lot of that food is junk, ultra-processed, full of empty calories, you're going to be low and depleted in multiple micronutrients and phytonutrients. And that's bad news, because that makes everything else worse. So you need to ramp all that up, and you need a broad spectrum micro and phytonutrient support program to bring your levels of all of these molecules up in your body to the levels we see in the blue zones, which are associated with much better health. And the fourth driver of chronic degenerative disease is something that I and some of my colleagues refer to as glycemic mismatch. The modern diet contains far too much sugar and simple starches, pouring glucose into the bloodstream. Fructose is another issue. And because we're so physically inactive compared to our ancestors, because we had PlayStations and cars and IT, where they would have done things by hand, our muscles aren't working effectively enough as a glucose sink. So you're pouring too much glucose in, not taking enough out, and that's one of the reasons why almost half the population in North America now has moved from hyperglycemia to hyperinsulinemia to metabolic syndrome, and then to frank clinical type 2 diabetes. And I don't think Australia is not that very far behind. And many of the advanced nations are doing the same thing. Now, the work of wonderful clinicians and scientists, people like Mike Lane, for example, but there's many others, have shown absolutely without any possibility of refutation that you can reverse these conditions by cutting down on sugars and starches and taking more exercise and losing a bit of weight in the process. For most people, the majority of people, that'll normalize your metabolism. So you can change your diet, take lots of exercise, and that's what I tell people to do. If you can't do it, if you won't do it, if you can't do it, perhaps because you're I don't know, you have peripheral neuropathy or you're hemiplegic or something like that, then there are various compounds derived from nature that the body interprets as exercise. They're called exercise mimetics. And that's something else. It's like a hack. It's like physical exercise in a capsule. And one of those has become a drug. It's metformin, which is, of course, used for many diabetics. It's now being repositioned as a kind of gerosuppressant because it has so many positive health outcomes. But there's a bunch of other molecules which are derived, like metformin was. That comes from Gallego officinalis, or French lilac. It was just made into a drug. There's lots of other natural compounds that do the same thing. And for anyone who's interested, visit my blog. If you go to my blog, which is drpaulclayton.eu, that's where I got on my soapbox. And I talk about all of these kinds of things in a way that's almost entirely non-commercial, but is full of references. So a typical post will have anywhere up.
I was going to say that, where could people, as we sort of wrap up here, I mean, obviously it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the podcast today, and we thank you from the Cellco Health podcast, and anyone listening who wanted to connect with you was going to be my question. And so clearly that's at drpaulclayton.eu, where they'd be able to find out more about your information. Is that right?
Yes. My publisher says to everyone that there's something there to annoy everybody. and I think that's actually what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to educate and maybe annoy enough for people to take appropriate action.
And I'm going to probably ask a question that I probably know the answer to, but you're probably too busy. But do you have any social media profiles where people will be able to contact or connect with you as well?
I don't do social media.
I thought so. So they'll be able to connect with you at your blog if they wanted to, and read further about what it is that you're doing. And I would like to say also, just from the podcast, and for those of you tuning in who'd like to learn more about the products we've discussed today, like the Balance Oil and the Balance Oil Test or Xenobiotic, you can find all the details on our website, or you can just head to the same page that you're watching this podcast on at the bottom, and you could get a lot of the information from there. So once again, I do want to say thank you, Dr. Clayton. It's been an incredible conversation, and hopefully we can do some good in the world with the information out there.
I hope so. There's a public health disaster that's taking place and continuing to unfold all around us. And I want to try to do something about that. And there are many other people who I'm working with who have the same motivation. At a certain point in time, you have all this theory, but there's no point. I mean, just knowing this stuff, you have to turn it into practice. It becomes a moral imperative, and that's why I do what I do.
Well, we appreciate that very much. It was a great conversation. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.